I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we get to the conversation on this edition of the show, I want to remind you that I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors. So it is you, the listener, that will ensure that this show keeps going in the future. If you want to help me out, you can email me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com to get in touch with me about how you can make a donation through PayPal. However, I strongly encourage you to support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Now, with that out of the way, we have a returning guest, Charlotte Dennett, a journalist and lawyer who co-wrote a book that I've mentioned on this show before, Thy Will Be Done: The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. She's also the author of a more recent book entitled Follow the Pipelines, uncovering the mystery of a lost spy and the deadly politics of the great game for oil, in which she details the story of her father, Daniel Dennett's involvement as a master spy in the Middle East, leading to his eventual death in a plane crash that remains shrouded in mystery. This led to Charlotte uncovering a world that she calls the great game for oil, and that will be the subject of our conversation today as we delve into the connection between Syria and the great game. And yes, in case you're wondering, Charlotte Dennett is the sister of the late American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel C. Dennett, who provided a foreword for Charlotte's book, Follow the Pipelines. I think you'll find this conversation rather fascinating, so why don't we get right to it with Charlotte Dennett. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very happy is able to return to the show. Her work has been influential for me ever since I found her and Gerard Colby's book, Thy Will Be Done: The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. And we're going to be talking about her most recent book and some updates involving it, Follow the Pipelines, which was released in 2020 and, is very relevant now in light of what has happened in Syria and what is still happening in Gaza since last time we spoke. How are you doing, Charlotte Dennett?
Sure. If I could mention the subtitle, it's Follow the Pipelines. Here, I'll show it up. Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. And the lost spy was my father, who was killed in a mysterious plane crash. And when we talk, I'd like to show this up because this map tells you a lot that's on the book, but we can get to that.
For people that are only listening to the audio version, we'll have to describe the maps a little bit. But maybe to start, for my listeners, even though I've had you on in the past, it's been a while. So maybe you could talk about what you mean about by the great game for oil.
Well, my father was America's first master spy in the Middle East. He was recruited into the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in 43. That eventually morphed into the Central Intelligence Group in 46, right before the CIA was created, and he died in a mysterious plane crash in 47. So I started investigating the causes of his death much later when I was reporter in Lebanon. And in the course of my investigation, I learned that the people that he was sent to Lebanon to spy on were not the Germans. They'd already been removed from the scene. And he was spying on our erstwhile allies, the British, the French, and the Soviets. And when I came to learn that, they were all intensely jealous that the United States had an exclusive concession in Saudi Arabia for its massive amount of oil, which would eventually elevate it to a superpower. And they were all intensely jealous that the Americans had gotten this concession. So they were trying to A, get into Saudi Arabia, B, weaken the United States. And that's when I began to learn about the Great Game, which in earlier century was the Great Game over Central Asia with the British, and once again the Russians. And later it morphs into a great game for oil because oil became the fuel of the military in 1911 when Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, head of the Navy, made the difficult decision to switch its fuel source from coal to oil, which was more efficient and cheaper. But Britain didn't have any oil, so they had to find it. He said, we have to go in a sea of troubles. And that sea of troubles meant, in part, competing rivals. Everyone was looking for oil because they realized it was the fuel of the military. And by World War II, um, the big lesson was that Germany lost World War One and World War II because its military machine had run out of gas. So you got it. And then I found this final point. Then I sued the CIA. I found that I got this wonderful document, which initially was heavily redacted. This is it. You'll see the last page. It's like this, you know, all blacked out. But the redactor left out this one really, really key sentence. And the sentence said in part that the possible extent of these oil deposits in Saudi Arabia are so great that we must control them at all costs. So the U.S. felt it had to control the oil, and all its competitors were trying to get at this oil and find other sources of oil. And that's where you have the great game, and they will go to all extents to get it. They will murder, they will pull off regime changes. I mean, at all costs is the important phrase in that sentence because it goes all the way up to the present, including Gaza, Lebanon, Syria. Yeah.
I want to get into that, but maybe before we do that, I want to get into how this ties into Syria, especially right now. But before we do that, what was the biggest revelation that came out of your looking into your father's story, and the biggest revelation that came out of writing this book for you?
Oh no. It's funny, I've never been asked that question. Biggest revelation was that our friends were really our enemies, which I just described. That was one of them. And another big revelation was that we've been fighting the Russians ever since the 40s. And the origin of the Cold War went way back to the struggle over oil, even before the early 50s when the Cold War was announced. So that was a big revelation. Uh, the fact that our, let's put it this way, that the both the British and the Russians um, are are possible culprits in the sabotage of my father's plane crash, and that the one person who would have been in charge of that was the most famous spy of the 20th century. His name was Kim Philby,
I was going to
and he
ask
served.
you about Kim Philby, but go on.
Yeah, well, he served two masters, you know. He was ostensibly head of counterintelligence for the British. He was my father's direct counterpart. He was posted in Turkey, but he was following a lot that was going on in Lebanon when my father was there. And counterintelligence is like the highest level of spying. It means you're involved in spy hunting, but you also have to protect your own organization. So we have Dennett and Philby, and to please the Brits who thought that he was spying for them, he had to give them some good intelligence. And he also had to please his real backers, I mean, the people that he was loyal to, and that was the Soviets. And through my investigation, I have come to a hypothesis. Let's put it this way: it's still circumstantial evidence, but I think combined, they certainly benefited from this Flight 3804 C-47 airplane with 6 people on board crashed after a top secret mission to Saudi Arabia. So those are some of the key ones. I'm sure more will come to my mind.
In terms of Syria, Syria comes up a lot in your book. What do you make of what has immediately happened in Syria with the overthrow of Assad? And how could this potentially tie into some of the areas that you explored in Follow the Pipelines?
Well, first of all, in any given crisis in the Middle East, it can happen elsewhere too, but since I'm following it most carefully, the coverage is incredibly superficial. And the geopolitical dimension, it gets to be discussed a little bit more. They use the word geopolitical now. You know, where do you have to go to get what you want to get, and how are you going to get it? So Syria, what's going on now is very fluid, but it seems very clear to me, knowing the history, which is seldom given, the context is seldom given, the oil connection is seldom given. There's been a plan to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria for years. I mean, certainly in 2000, let's see, 2001, right after 9/11, Wesley Clark, the former NATO commander, had a meeting with a Pentagon official, and he cited 7 countries that they were going to overthrow in 5 years. And Iraq and Syria were top of the list. Lebanon, Somalia, Iran, they've all been hit. But it took a lot longer than five.
Not to interrupt you, but I was just saying to
Yeah,
someone
go ahead.
today,
Go ahead.
Iran is the last one standing now.
Really? Yeah, yeah, you're right. So this is a long-term plan. And what is that long-term plan? Again, the end game that is seldom described. Why are they doing? Why would Joe Biden, who's so conscious of his legacy, why would he jeopardize it by engaging in genocide? Arming, um, arming Israel while the genocide continues. So coming back to Syria, um, listen, this is how you got to look at the world in the Middle East, and I'm taking you back to this. All right, this is the Eastern Mediterranean. That whole Eastern Mediterranean was the terminal point for pipelines. One a pipeline that went to Syria. and it was built in the 30s. A pipeline that went to Haifa, Palestine, also built in the 30s. And that was the result of World War I, when that area was divided up among the colonial powers, and the French controlled Syria and Lebanon, and the British controlled Palestine. Okay, so there was a pipeline there built in the 30s, and that was very important for the war efforts coming up in World War II. But then the creation of the State of Israel closed the pipeline to Haifa, Palestine. Meanwhile, Syria is part of this whole region, and Netanyahu and his Likud party and the neocons who were backing George W. Bush have long dreamed of creating a new Middle East and creating an energy corridor all the way up along that region that borders the Mediterranean. And because Israel now has 500 billion dollars worth of oil and natural gas off their coast. That's a factor in the Gaza war. We can get into it. But another thing I found out is that in 2011, when the uprising are starting against Assad, um, there was a scheme by the British to run a pipeline from Qatar, which is off the coast of Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's on the eastern side of Saudi Arabia, juts out into the Red, not the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf. Qatar was going to run a pipeline, and the ideal location was to run through Syria. And Syria rejected it. Why? Because they were worried that that would affect the Russians, who were their primary backers at the time. Russia had a major port on the Mediterranean, so there was this symbiotic relationship. You know, the Syrians gave the Russians the port, and the Russians supported Syria. So here comes the West that wants to run a pipeline through Syria and go all the way up to Europe and supply oil and natural gas. Assad rejected it. Meanwhile, he was developing the idea of running a pipeline from Iran that would eventually traverse Syria, and he approved that one. And the West didn't like that idea at all. So I have a whole chapter in my book, and it's called Was the Syrian Civil War a Pipeline War? And there's a lot of evidence that it was. And once again, that elevates the role of pipelines, because a contemporary of my father called them arteries of empire. You know, what good is the oil if it's just sitting there? It's not bringing profits, right? It's not providing fuel to the military. So you got to ship it. And how do you do it? You can do it by tanker, but the most effective way is, and the cheapest way, is to run it by pipelines. But you got to protect the pipelines because you don't know who's going to sabotage the pipelines. A lot of that was done during the 30s when the Arab revolt was going on, and then the Jews were revolting against the British, and so it became very clear that you have to protect the pipelines and control them at all costs. And the way you do it is you send in the military. And when you send in the military, you get escalation going on. It's not always a smooth operation. So ultimately, what I'm saying is the civil war that started in 2011 in Syria soon escalated way beyond just local protesters I mean, let's face it, yes, Assad was a serious dictator. He became much worse after the civil war became. I just got that from a MSNBC reporter who actually acknowledged it. It got worse. Well, why did it get worse? Because what's been called the Syrian civil war is really an effort to overthrow the government of Assad, and that's been on the books at least since the 2001 statement. We have to bring down 7 countries in 5 years. It even goes back even further to the neocons talking about a new American century and
Right, the project for a new
saying,
American century.
yeah,
Yes.
project for a new American. They're going to remake the Middle East, and they're gonna really do well. With their oil profits. The way it had worked is that the big guys, the super powerful Exxon Mobil, BP, you name it, the Shell, they were always getting the lucrative contracts. And the neocons, a lot of them based in the Southwest Texas, Oklahoma, and so on, who were actually big backers of Bush and Cheney, they wanted to get in. All right. So getting into Iraq was a big dream, but all these other countries are going to remake it. This is the long-term plan. And so who are these rebels that are suddenly supported by Turkey to go in? It's clear they took advantage of the weaknesses that had incurred since the war in Gaza and Lebanon, and Hezbollah was greatly defeated in Lebanon, and Hamas was greatly hurt in Gaza, and Russia's bogged down with the war in Ukraine. So this was the optimum time to act. But my ultimate theory about the whole thing is that Netanyahu, and it's documented in my book, that he had a plan for an energy corridor running up that whole coast. And one of the other plans was to reopen both the Iraq petroleum pipeline and have it, go back to Haifa. That was his goal right after the U.S. invaded Iraq. He was saying the oil is going to it's going to flow to Haifa soon, and it's not a pipe dream, but it was, and it still has not been reopened. Another idea is to reopen the Trans-Arabian pipeline that was closed in the 80s, mid 80s during the Lebanese Civil War. And part of that may be a memo of understanding that was signed by Biden and I believe Saudi Arabia, France, and maybe Germany. You can look it up. It's called the India Middle East Corridor. And that is to link India through an underground pipeline, then run it across Saudi Arabia to Haifa, and it's going to carry natural gas. And they say this is good because it's cleaner energy. So that's how they're presenting it. But this is all part of the plan. This is why the United States didn't object to the genocide, because they know that if you're going to run a massive infrastructure project, you can't do it without the big banks supporting it, and the big banks won't support it as long as there's conflict. So what do? You wipe out all those radicals, and you flatten Gaza, you flatten Lebanon. Now you're trying to flatten and go right up the coast, flatten Syria. And right now the Americans are bombing Syria. Who's stopping them? And the Israelis are bombing Syria.
I was
Yeah,
going to say there's strikes by the US, Israel, and Turkey all in
yeah,
Syria right now. Yeah.
that's right. Oh, they're all positioning. And by the way, isn't it interesting how the media has forgotten the fact that yes, there are American troops stationed in eastern Syria. Well, where are they stationed around? It's where the Syria has the most of its oil reserves. It's not a whole lot, but they got them there. Those troops are there ostensibly to fight ISIS. Give me a break. This is the excuse they always use.
I
Sometimes
wanted
they
you to talk
even,
more about Islamic State and your analysis of Islamic State and the Syrian war, if you could.
yeah, well, the Islamic State, I'd have to, I'm a little rusty on it. It's all in my book, but there's strong evidence that the Islamic State became useful to the CIA and the Defense Department and so on. Because as long as you had them in certain areas of that were deemed to be of great interest to the Americans, As long as they were there, then you had a pretext for sending in the troops. And that's why you have some 900 American troops stationed around this very part of it borders Iraq and Syria, and that's where ISIS was created, right? And there you go. They're there to protect ISIS. Give me a break. They're not to protect ISIS, but to protect American interests against ISIS. No, ISIS is used. So is Al Qaeda, and these two groups were used to go after Assad during the civil war. So it's murky, but what I feel for is the people, of course. The people of Syria have suffered terribly, but you have to question everything that comes out of the State Department, the CIA, the U.S. government, explanations of what they're doing in the Middle East, because the entire time they are disguising the real role that they're playing. We must protect the oil at all costs. That's what it's all about. Simple as
Now,
that.
to be fair, I don't think you're saying that there isn't, um, for example, like real organic on the ground anger at Assad over the years, but you're saying that I mean within Syria itself, there were Syrians that were legitimately protesting
Absolutely.
Assad.
Yes.
But you're
Yeah.
saying that there's these sort of subterranean forces, outside forces outside of Syria, like the US, and all these other different players that are trying to manipulate things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what happened because it started out as a legitimate uh, uh, pro democracy movement because, Assad had had really instituted reign of terror. It's true. And I mean, you see the conditions in those prisons. He actually had uh, black black sites of torture that he had set up for the CIA earlier on.
I was
So
gonna say,
yes,
I
he
believe those black sites were used in torture in during the War on Terror years. Yeah.
yeah, that I mean they were. Okay. So I have no illusions about Assad. I feel for the people of Syria, that's all. And the fact of the matter is that um, one has to ask what created him and his father. By the way, under his father, uh, Syria was always looked at as a hostile um, country to Israel. It was part of what was called the rejection front. And these were, it's sort of the same axis of resistance that they're not talking about. Iraq and Syria were headed by nationalists and secular nationalists, and they were opposed to the state of Israel, which has a long history of colonialism in Palestine, now Israel. I mean, when people say it was a colonial settler state, it most certainly was. It was set up by the British. And why did the British want Jews to go to Palestine? Because they wanted a European community that would protect the pipeline that ran to Haifa. You may think this is simplistic. It's not. I've got it backed up by multiple sources. And with all the conflicts, I acknowledge all that. But let's think about who are experts in divide and rule. So, anyway, the rejection front was a group of states that just didn't buy making peace with Israel because they saw what it was. And you can find histories of Syria. You got to go back. You have to constantly go back in history to get your answers to why we are where we are. So,
Now,
yeah.
I had a question. So your father's last report before his death, uh, it revealed certain things about Syria, right? Like I guess the government of Syria objected to the Trans-Arabian Pipeline or TAP line
Yeah. Yeah,
crossing
you got
through the
that
Golan
right.
Heights. Could
Yes,
you talk more
correct.
about that?
Yeah, yeah. So, he died in this plane crash before the pipeline could be completed. And his last report was talking about how there was resistance to having it terminate in or cross Syria. The president of Syria didn't want it. He was opposed to, he was a nationalist. His name was Kuatli. And he was telling my father and the U.S. Ambassador George Wadsworth in 1947 that he didn't want that going through there. And besides, he was very worried about a Russian, French, Zionist sort of cabal. He was really worried about this. This is 1947. It was before the State of Israel was created. So what happened is, my father's last report is saying, there's this serious problem, and Aramco, the Arab American oil company, was also very concerned, and the end result was after my father's death, um, they the CIA conducted its first coup d'état. It's not Iran, it's Syria. They got rid of the nationalists, Kuatli. They put in place I forget if it's an army chief or a police chief um, to okay the pipeline traversing through Syria. And where did it go through? The Golan Heights, which was later occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. So, yeah, the first coup. There you go. And one of the people, by the way, this kind of interests people. One of the people who was following the same sort of investigative track I was, and found that he had to keep going back, wrote an article in Politico called Why the Arabs Don't Want America in Syria. Guess who he was? Robert Kennedy Jr. He wrote a piece in Politico that is very interesting. You can find it under that title. And I talk about it in the book. And what he was doing, he wanted to know more about the Palestinian Sirhan, who had killed his father. So that had him, like me, going back and back and back. And the interesting thing is, we both landed at the same place, the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. And then his story traces it up through the present and all the machinations that were going on to get the oil, to protect pipelines, and there you go. And he laid it all out. Later on, while he's running for president, he did a complete about face that really bothered me.
Yeah, I
And
was gonna
he
say he wrote the article you mentioned. He wrote that in like
to,
2016, and then he does this
correct.
about face. Yeah, go on.
Oh yeah. Oh, he becomes a complete opportunist in my view. And he's suddenly becoming a Zionist and saying that there's no genocide in Gaza and completely supporting Israel. I would, someone who wrote that, how could he do that? Well, he was running for president. So, anyway, but that 2016 article is a very interesting one, and it will shed more light on Syria if you want to know the background.
This is like out of left field maybe, but one of the areas of interest for me has been Azerbaijan, especially since the horrors we saw with the expulsion of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. Uh, does that tie
Yeah,
into any of this at all?
totally. I wrote about it. I think I wrote a piece in Counterpunch about it. Yeah, Azerbaijan, which is of course huge oil petropower, and in the last couple of years was making moves on this Nagorno-Karabakh, was an Armenian enclave. Armenia was supposed to have their own, quote, mandate after World War I. Wilson tried to get it for him because he felt guilty about the genocide. But it never happened because the Russians ended up occupying Baku, which is like the key port city there. And as one person said, oh, too bad for Armenia, it doesn't have any oil. So that mandate never happened. But eventually they had this little smallish territory, which is next to a much larger area called Armenia. And again, you got to look at the map, but this is all bordering the Caspian Sea. And so, anyway, Azerbaijan had, in the past couple of years, has ethnically cleansed Armenian from it's also called Artsakh. It's their real
That's the
homeland.
name Armenians use to refer
Yeah,
to it.
and
Yeah.
and 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 they were warning about it. They were saying, "Oh my God, we're going to be subjected to genocide all over again." A film was made up about it. I wrote about the film, drawing attention to it, but they just succeeded. And guess who helped them? The Israelis. The Israelis helped them ethnically cleanse the Armenians.
I was going to say the Israelis and also, and I don't know if this ties into things as well because we see them in Syria as well. We see Turkey support Azerbaijan in its conflict with Armenia. So it seems like
Abs-
Turkey and Israel always pop up. Why
well,
is it
well,
that
yeah.
Turkey pops up in this so
Well,
much?
well, look at the map and you see where Turkey is. You had a major pipeline taking the oil of from the Caspian Sea and ending up in Turkey, and that's all in my book. I've got 12 pipeline maps in my book, and if you just read the captions of those maps, you'll get an understanding of what's in my book if you don't have time to read the whole thing. But at any rate, yeah, they had a pipeline, and Turkey sees itself also as a major energy corridor because not only does it border Europe, which is desperate now for energy, ever since the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was sabotaged. And Biden made no secret of how he wanted to eliminate that pipeline that originated in Russia and went under the Baltic Sea and then ended up in Germany. And it was going to supply even more cheap energy to Europe. Well, the US didn't want that. They're always playing this bypass game. How can we build pipelines that bypass Russians, and how can we defeat the Russians and get more oil and natural gas to Europe? And so that's what it's about. Turkey is well placed also to be an energy corridor, and it also sits on the Mediterranean. So obviously, you know, they see themselves as big players. And at one point they'll be pro US, and another point they will be anti, because Turkey would like to see itself as reviving the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkish, that once controlled this whole area. And so he Erdogan envisions himself as becoming the new great Turkish leader of the Middle East.
Yeah, I
Plus
think he has
Russia,
sort of, I would say like neo-Ottoman
pan-Turkish.
aspirations. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. And so he has an alliance with Azerbaijan. They're all playing the game. That's what they're all doing. And who cares about the people that are caught in the middle? And of course, there's the great irony that the victims of genocide have now become the perpetrators of genocide. And I think this is really difficult for Jews who valued certainly Israel as a safe place to be from anti-Semitism. And what's happened instead? Netanyahu has turned the whole world against Israel. I mean, practically the whole world. And then you wonder why there's an increase of anti Semitism. So, the way I look at it is that Israel is like this giant battleship for the U.S. The reason all the money is going in there uh, is to protect U.S. interests, and that's oil. And it's not safe anymore. It's not. You could call it a death camp. So it's time, and the problem is that the Israelis are not getting the whole story. They're getting propagandized about this war. And so are the Americans are not getting the whole story. And the suffering is horrendous. It's got to stop. But I don't think it will stop. And I don't see a good outlook for those beautiful Syrian people who are so happy to be free of a dictatorship. Well, how long is that going to last? I mean, the rebels that were supported by Turkey were asking, I have a document that says they were literally asking Israel to be with them, to stand by them. But Israel, meanwhile, is saying, well, we don't trust them because they were on the terrorist list, right? And so then Israel comes in and says, well, we're going to bomb Syria because who's going to stop us? I mean, the International Criminal Court and the ICJ and Amnesty International can all condemn Israel for genocide, but it still goes on what it's doing. And why? Because it's got American backing.
I just had two more questions. The first is we mentioned earlier Wesley Clark and naming all those states, and each of
Yeah,
them have gone down, incidentally, since he has said that. Iran is the
yeah,
last one standing. What do you
yeah.
see in terms of the future when it comes to Iran? I'm worried about with the Trump
Grim,
administration, we could even have
grim.
a war.
Yeah, grim. I mean, uh, Trump and some of his backers, and Israel, right? Trump totally supports Israel. Jared Kushner has big plans for Israel. He wants to
Well,
turn
yeah,
Gaza
and
in.
Trump gets that Miriam Adelson money too. So,
Oh, that's right. That's right. And Kushner wants Gaza to have become waterfront property. He said it would make nice waterfront property. Okay. So anyway, they've been hankering to to go after Iran. Why? Because they want the oil. That's in my book too. Cheney always bemoaned the fact that to create this new Middle East where the neocons were going to get greater play in the oil game, but they couldn't get Iran. They just couldn't get Iran. And so now is their chance. I mean, they did go in and bomb some nuclear sites there, underground or whatever, military sites, but some of it was nuclear related. So we have to be very worried about what their plans are. And of course, the neoliberals under Biden and company have tried to strike a deal. I mean, they've become much more sophisticated in how they run the world, so to speak. You know, that Rockefeller, who I wrote about in a previous book, um, was the Rockefellers were the family that controlled energy in the 20th century, and they learned through trial and error what worked and what didn't. And one of the things they learned was don't go in with a sledgehammer, and don't use direct rule like the Brits did because that only creates resentment. No, you do it through economics, and you can do it by, giving loans, but you can also do it by sanctioning. And one thing that they have been doing is they resume under Trump. He resumed the sanctions against Iran, and it has worn Iran down. So Iran has a lot of domestic problems. Also, it's run by these religious fundamentalists. And when I was in Iran in the mid '70s, under the Shah, it was still a secular country, and there's a lot going on. I mean, they're beautiful people. They're very artistic. They have a fantastic history, but they've been weakened, and I think we should be very worried about what happens to Iran. It's not going to bode well once Trump comes in. It's going to get worse because they will go in with a sledgehammer. They don't care.
before we close out, I think one of the criticisms I'll get for this episode, and I did get it for the last episode we had, and
Did you? Oh, let me
well,
know later.
the criticism I always get when I have you on, and I don't agree with this criticism because I think you're very hard-nosed about the facts, but people will say, "Oh, this sounds." People will
Too
say
simplistic?
reductionist and conspiratorial. They'll say this sounds like a conspiracy theory. How do you want to respond to those people?
It, it's all based in the facts. If you get my book, great Christmas present, friends. if you want to understand what's going on in the Middle East. But anyway, I couldn't resist that. But at any rate,
I
no,
appreciate that was a great plug.
no, it's heavily documented, heavily resourced. I have not gotten criticisms, as far as I know, about being conspiratorial. This is the first time I've heard it. It doesn't surprise me. Yes, there's all these ethnic conflicts, and it can get very complicated. But the reason people throw that at me is because you never hear about it. I keep drumming on this subject because this is what the ultimate enemy is. It's big oil. It's the military industrial complex. It's the big banks. They're calling the shots. They're making the profits, and they're lying to you, just the way they lied about climate change. And that's the one thing that drives me crazy. I mean, people who hate big oil for its lies on climate change still have a hard time sort of grasping how big oil could be behind the endless wars in the Middle East. I document it all. I'm very, very careful about my documentation precisely to ward off these critics. I mean, I want to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and I mean you've had great reviews even from people like former Time correspondent William Dow, who was a Middle East correspondent for Time, gave a great review of your previous book, the one before Follow the Pipeline. So your books have gotten attention even
No,
amongst the mainstream. Yeah.
well, they have, but they've also been suppressed. I mean, the Thy Will Be Done, the Rockefeller book, was suppressed, and it was rescued by Open Road Media, so you can get an electronic version. That's where I really learned how the world works. As I like to say, you got to go to the top of the mountain, and when you get to the top, that was Rockefeller, and look down, the view is incredible. You're seeing all these interlinks. You're seeing all the people that are captive to them, and then you wonder why they don't support you. It's because they're getting Rockefeller money, right? There's a lot of that going, I can tell you that. But at any rate, it's a struggle. That's why I plugged my book. It's such a struggle to get this out there, and yet I'm determined to keep at it because I think people need this history. And I thank you for giving me the time.
Well, you know what? We're gonna have to do a whole show on that will be done at some point. We'll plan that out maybe if you're open to it, because that's
For
one that
sure.
deserves revisiting. But thanks
Yeah.
again,
Well,
Charlotte Dennett.
thank you.
How can my listeners get a copy of the book?
Yeah, well, Amazon.com is the most obvious. Whatever you think of Amazon, it's the easiest way. And Chelsea Green is my publisher. They're in Vermont. But and then just you can order it through your local bookstore. That's how you can get a hold of it. So happy reading, happy map looking. It'll blow your mind, I guarantee it. Everyone who's read my book, well, not, just about everyone who's read it, just say, whoa, scales taken off from my eyes, including Jewish audiences. They're blown away. So.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Charlotte Dennett, and that, as always, you'll consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. new forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.